The rain came down hard on the night Evelina Ashworth stood at the kitchen door of Larkspur Hall, her shawl soaked through, her stomach hollow with a hunger she had learned not to speak of aloud. She was not begging for herself alone. Her mother had not eaten a proper meal in 3 days, giving her portion to the younger children, and Evelina had walked 2 miles in the dark to ask Mrs. Pemberton Evelyn's own family's grand kitchen for whatever scraps the great house could spare. It was a humiliation she had rehearsed 100 times in her mind, and still it did not prepare her for the shame of actually standing there, knuckles raised to knock, knowing that inside those warm golden windows sat the family that had once called her cousin, before poverty made her an inconvenience they preferred to forget. She let her hand fall before she knocked. It was easier to imagine dignity than to perform it. A voice came from the shadows near the wood stack, low and unhurried. "You look as though you are arguing with a door." Evelina startled and turned. A man sat on an overturned crate beneath the eave, out of the worst of the rain, but not sheltered from it entirely. His coat patched at the elbow, his boots caked with the mud of the lane, a beard shadowing a jaw that looked as though it had not been barbered in weeks. A beggar, she thought, or a tinker between towns, one of the many drifting men the war and the harvests had left without a trade. His eyes, though, unsettled her. They were too steady, too attentive, for a man who owned nothing. "I did not mean to disturb you," she said, drawing her shawl tighter. "You have not disturbed me. I have been disturbing myself for an hour, wondering whether the cook here has any mercy in her, or only rules." He tilted his head toward the door. "You are hungry." It was not a question, and something in her chest reacted to being seen so plainly, after months of being invisible to everyone who mattered. "I am asking on behalf of my family," she said, lifting her chin. "There is no shame in that." "No," he agreed, and something shifted in his voice, quiet and certain. "There is no shame in it at all." They knocked together, in the end, because he rose and rapped twice on the door before she could stop him, and when the cook opened it with a lantern raised and a scowl already forming, it was the stranger who spoke first, asking with unhurried courtesy whether there might be bread and broth enough for 2 hungry travelers who meant no trouble. Evelina would remember, later, how strange it was that a man with nothing to his name spoke to a cook as though he were accustomed to being obeyed, and how the cook, gruff as she was, softened before that quiet authority as though some old instinct told her to listen. She did not yet know his name. She did not yet know that within a fortnight the whole of the county would know it, and that her own fate, and her sister's, and the future of Larkspur Hall itself would turn upon a man she had first mistaken for a beggar in the rain. 3 years earlier, the Ashworths had been a family of modest comfort, not wealth, but enough. Her father had been a gentleman of small property and smaller ambition, content to raise his daughters quietly in the manner his own father had built, until a series of bad harvests, a foolish investment in a shipping venture that sank with all its cargo, and a debt inherited from an uncle nobody had loved, brought the family low enough that the manor itself had to be let to strangers, and the Ashworths removed to a cottage on the edge of the parish that even the tenants of Larkspur Hall considered beneath their notice. Evelina's mother had never recovered from the shame of it. Her younger sister, Cassandra, had recovered rather too well, in Evelina's private opinion, transforming herself within a single season into the loveliest girl in 3 parishes, a golden-haired vision whose poverty seemed only to make her more romantic in the eyes of every eligible bachelor who saw her weep prettily at the assembly rooms about her family's misfortune. Cassandra had a gift, undeniable and slightly terrifying, for being pitied and admired in the very same breath. Evelina had no such gift. She was accounted plain by anyone who troubled to compare her to her sister, though in truth she was merely ordinary, brown-haired and grey-eyed, and unremarkable in the way that made people's gazes slide past her toward something brighter. Where Cassandra wept, Evelina worked. Where Cassandra charmed, Evelina mended, cooked, bargained with tradesmen, nursed her mother's nerves, and walked to Larkspur Hall in the rain to beg for bread, because someone in the family had to be practical, and it was never going to be Cassandra. She did not resent her sister for this, not exactly. She resented the world for deciding, so early and so thoroughly, which sister was worth saving. The stranger's name, she learned that first night, was simply Reese. He offered no surname, and she did not press for one, assuming a man in his circumstances had reasons enough to keep such things close. They sat together on the kitchen step, while the cook, whose name was Mrs. Downing, and whose bark proved considerably worse than her bite, ladled out broth thick with barley and bones, and pressed a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth into Evelina's hands for her family besides. "You did not eat your share," Reese observed, when Evelina had taken only a few spoonfuls before setting the bowl aside. "I ate enough." "You did not." He said it without accusation, only quiet fact, the way a man might note that it had begun to rain again. "You are giving half your portion away in your mind before you have even left this step. To your mother, I would guess, or the younger ones." She looked at him properly then, unsettled by how near the mark he had struck. "You read a great deal into a stranger, for a man who has told me nothing of himself." "There is little to tell," he said, and something flickered behind his eyes that she could not name, gone before she could study it. "I have walked further than I care to remember, and eaten worse than I care to admit, and I find that hunger teaches a man to notice who around him is also hungry, and who only pretends to be, for advantage." "You think I pretend? I think," he said, "that you have not told me a single lie since we sat down, and that is rarer than you know." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and they sat in a silence that should have been uncomfortable, and was not, listening to the rain soften against the stones, until the hour grew too late, and she had to walk the 2 miles home with her loaf of bread held against her chest, like something precious. She did not expect to see him again. Beggars and travellers did not stay in one parish long, not when winter was closing in and the roads still held. She saw him again 3 days later, in the lane behind the Larkspur stables, mending a fence rail, with a competence that struck her as strange for a man who claimed to own nothing, his sleeves rolled to reveal forearms that had clearly done honest labor before, whatever his current circumstances. He looked up when her cartwheel caught in a rut nearby and crossed without being asked to help her free it, his hands steady and sure on the wood, and when the wheel came loose, he did not immediately release her cart, but studied her face instead. "You are troubled," he said. "I am always troubled. It is a condition of being an Ashworth these days." "Ashworth," he repeated the name slowly, as though testing its weight. "The family that once held Larkspur. The family that once held everything," she said, more bitterly than she intended, "and now holds a cottage with a leaking roof, and a mother who has not left her bed in a fortnight because the shame of it all sits on her chest like a stone. Forgive me, you did not ask for a confession." "I find I do not mind confessions," he said, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, a warmth that did not match his ragged coat or his unshaven jaw. "Tell me of your mother." So she did. She told him, standing in the mud of the lane with her cartwheel freed and no reason left to linger, except that she wanted to, about her mother's nerves and her father's quiet defeat, and her sister's determined brightness, and how the family's entire hope now rested on Cassandra, securing a good match before the last of their small savings ran out, because a good marriage was the only rescue a family like theirs could still hope for. She told him things she had not told anyone, not even the vicar's wife who fancied herself a confidant, and she could not afterward have explained why, except that Reese listened the way very few people ever had, as though her words carried genuine weight, as though she herself mattered beyond her usefulness. "And you," he said, when she had finished, "what do you hope for in all this?" The question startled her, because no one had asked it in longer than she could remember. Her family asked what she would do for them. No one asked what she wanted. "I hope," she said slowly, working it out as she spoke, "that my mother recovers her health, that my father finds some peace, that Cassandra marries well and is happy in it, truly happy, not merely secure. She paused. For myself, I confess I have stopped hoping for much. It seems an indulgence a woman in my position cannot afford. Something crossed his face then, quick and troubled, gone before she could name it. That, he said quietly, is the saddest thing I have heard in a long while, and I have heard a great many sad things on the road. She did not know that he was, in that moment, furious, though not at her. She did not know that the fury was directed at a world that had taught a clever, generous, quietly extraordinary woman to consider her own happiness an indulgence, and that the man standing before her in a beggar's coat had spent the last decade of his life being told the precise opposite, that his happiness was the only thing that mattered, by people who wanted something from him in return for saying so. She did not know, because he had not told her, and would not tell her yet, that his name was not Rees at all, or rather that Rees was his given name, and nothing more, and that the surname he withheld was one that made men bow and women calculate, the name of a duke whose arrival in the county had been expected for a fortnight, and had not yet, so far as anyone knew, occurred. The Duke of Ashcombe had come early, and in disguise, for reasons that had everything to do with a letter his late father had written him on his deathbed, and a promise extracted with his final breath. His father had arranged, years before, an understanding between the Ashcombe title and the Larkspur family, back when the Ashworths still held their manor and their fortune, a quiet contract that if circumstances allowed, the Ashcombe heir would marry an Ashworth daughter, uniting two old families and two adjoining estates. The understanding had lain dormant through his father's illness and his own mourning, until his father's dying wish revived it, along with a warning that troubled Rees more than he liked to admit. "Do not trust the report of a ballroom," his father had said, gripping his hand with the last of his strength. "A ballroom will tell you who is beautiful. It will not tell you who is good. Go and see for yourself, before you commit the estate and your own heart to a stranger's word." So he had gone, not as the Duke of Ashcombe in his fine carriage with his retinue and his signet ring, but as a nameless traveller, unwashed and unremarkable, to observe the Ashworth family as they truly were, unguarded by the performance that wealth and title always summoned in others. He had watched Cassandra Ashworth at the village well, charming and lovely and utterly aware of her own charm, weeping artfully to an audience of two farmers' wives about her family's reduced circumstances in a manner so calculated that he had felt something in him grow cold and wary. He had not yet found her sister, the elder one, the one his father's old correspondence had mentioned only in passing as sensible and likely to be overlooked. He had not expected to find her at a kitchen door in the rain, hungry and proud, and giving away her own dinner in her mind before she had even eaten it. He had not expected, in the days since, to find himself arranging his mending work and his errands to fall in her path, to find himself thinking of her grey eyes and her quiet, unpolished honesty at odd hours of the night, when he ought to have been thinking of estate ledgers and tenant complaints and all the duties that awaited him the moment he resumed his true name. He had expected, if he was honest with himself, to find in Cassandra Ashworth a wife suitable to a duke's requirements, beautiful and biddable and grateful for rescue. He had not expected to fall, slowly and without permission, for her overlooked sister instead. The days that followed brought Evelina and Rees together, with a frequency that she told herself was coincidence, though some quieter part of her suspected otherwise, and did not examine the suspicion too closely, for fear of what hoping for it might cost her. He appeared at the edge of the market when she went to haggle over the price of flour, and somehow the miller's son gave her a fairer price than usual, though she never saw Rees speak a word to him. He appeared near the churchyard when she walked her mother to services, and carried the old woman's shawl and prayer book without being asked, with a courtesy that seemed at odds with his rough clothes, and her mother, who ordinarily noticed nothing beyond her own suffering, remarked afterward that there was something in that beggar's bearing she could not quite place, something that reminded her, oddly, of her own late father, who had been a colonel. "He carries himself like a man who has commanded other men," her mother said, "not like a man who has begged from them." Evelina laughed the observation away at the time, though it lodged in her mind like a splinter, small and persistent. It was in the orangery at Larkspur Hall, of all places, that the bond between them deepened past the point of easy denial. Evelina had gone to the great house on an errand for the new tenant family who had let the manor, delivering mended linens Mrs. Downing had commissioned from her, since sewing was one of the few skills that still earned the Ashworths a little coin. She found Rhys there among the orange trees, tending them with a careful, knowledgeable hand that again struck her as strange for a wandering man, pruning dead growth with a small knife he must have borrowed, or perhaps owned, though she could not imagine why a beggar would carry a pruning knife. "You have a gift for growing things," she said, setting down her basket of linens. "I have had a great deal of time to learn it," he said, which she took, wrongly, to mean the idle hours of a vagrant's life, and which he meant, truthfully, to mean the long, solitary years since his mother's death, when the gardens of Ashcombe had been the only place his grief felt private enough to breathe. "Tell me something true," she said suddenly, surprising herself with her own boldness. "You have listened to my confessions for a fortnight now, and told me nothing in return. Tell me something true about yourself, Rhys, or I shall begin to think you have no truths to tell." He set down the knife. For a long moment he looked at her, and she had the strange sensation of watching a man weigh a decision far heavier than the question warranted. "I have lost people I loved," he said finally, quietly. "My mother, some years past. My father, more recently, and more painfully, because his death came with a duty I did not ask for and do not know how to carry well. I have spent much of my life being told what I owe to others, my name, my title, my blood, and very little time being asked what I actually wish for myself." He paused. "That is truer than anything I have said to another soul in a very long while." "Your title," she repeated softly, and something in her chest went very still. "You have a title." For a moment, she thought he might tell her everything, right there among the orange trees with the winter light slanting gold through the glass, and something in his face suggested he wanted to, badly, the words rising and then retreating like a wave that could not quite reach the shore. But a footman's voice called from the passage just then, summoning Rhys away on some pretense that Evelina did not understand, but that he obeyed with visible reluctance, and the moment passed, and she was left standing among the orange trees with a question unanswered, and a suspicion she did not yet know how to name. She did not have long to wonder before circumstance forced the issue, though not in the manner she expected. The letter arrived at the Ashworth cottage on a grey Tuesday, sealed with a crest Evelina did not immediately recognize, though her mother recognized it at once, and grew so pale that Evelina feared she might faint. It was from the estate of Ashcombe, informing the family that His Grace the Duke of Ashcombe would be arriving in the parish within the fortnight to formally call upon the family, in accordance with an understanding arranged between the late Duke and Evelina's own late grandfather years before, an understanding that named an Ashworth daughter as his intended bride. "He is coming for Cassandra," her mother breathed, clutching the letter to her chest, as though it were a rope thrown to a drowning woman. "Oh, Evelina, he must be coming for Cassandra. Look at her, and look at you. Forgive me, my dear, but you must see it as plainly as I do. A duke will want beauty. He will want Cassandra." The letter did not specify which daughter, only an Ashworth daughter, a vagueness that Evelina's mother resolved instantly and without discussion in her younger daughter's favor, already planning gowns and hairstyles and the precise angle at which Cassandra ought to be seated to catch the most flattering light. Evelina, standing at the edge of this sudden whirlwind of hope, felt something curl cold and small in her stomach, a feeling she refused to examine, because examining it would mean admitting that some foolish, undisciplined part of her heart had begun, without her permission, to hope that the intended bridegroom might be a duke and not merely a man in a beggar's coat, that the two might somehow be one and the same, and that hope, she reminded herself sharply, was an indulgence she could not afford. She did not see Rhys for 4 days after the letter arrived. She told herself this too was coincidence, though the ache of his absence taught her, more thoroughly than any confession could have, exactly how much she had come to depend on the sight of him. When she did see him again, it was in circumstances that changed everything. The Duke of Ashcombe's arrival was announced for the following Saturday, and the whole parish buzzed with the news. Cassandra, most of all, who spent every waking hour in front of the small, cracked mirror in their shared bedroom, practicing expressions of gentle surprise and modest delight for the moment His Grace would first behold her. Evelina helped her sister prepare with the same quiet efficiency she brought to every family crisis, taking in a seam here, pressing a ribbon there, and told herself sternly that whatever foolishness had bloomed in her heart over a beggar's kindness had no bearing whatsoever on the arrival of an actual duke, a man she had never met and would likely never speak to beyond the barest civility, since dukes did not, as a rule, converse with the plain elder sisters of the young women they intended to court. On the Friday before his arrival, Evelina walked once more to Larkspur Hall, this time not to beg, but to return a mended tablecloth to Mrs. Downing, and found the great house in an uproar of preparation, servants polishing and airing rooms that had stood closed for years, a flurry of activity that made no sense for the arrival of tenants but made perfect sense, she would soon understand, for the arrival of a duke who was, in fact, already living beneath that very roof. She found Rhys in the stable yard, and her relief at seeing him again was so immediate and so unguarded that she nearly ran to him before she caught herself. "You have been avoiding me," she said, more accusation than question. "I have been occupied," he said, and there was something strained in his voice, some private battle she could not read. "Evelina, there is something I must tell you, something I ought to have told you a fortnight ago, and I have been a coward in the delaying of it." Her heart began to pound, though whether from hope or dread she could not have said. "Tell me now, then." But before he could speak, the stable yard filled with the sudden clatter of a grand carriage arriving a full day ahead of schedule, footmen leaping down, a coachman calling out titles and greetings, and among the confusion, the estate's steward came hurrying across the yard, bowing low before Rhys, with a deference that made no sense at all for a beggar. "Your Grace," the steward said, breathless, "forgive the early arrival of the party from London. We were not prepared to receive them until tomorrow, but Lord Pemberton insisted upon—" The steward's words continued, but Evelina heard nothing after those first two syllables. "Your Grace." She looked at Rhys, at the patched coat, and the unshaven jaw, and the eyes that had listened to her every confession with such careful attention, and understood, all at once, and with a violence that stole the breath from her lungs, exactly who she had been speaking to all this time. "You are the Duke," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended, smaller than the enormity of the betrayal deserved. "Evelina, you are the Duke of Ashcombe." She stepped back from him, as though the ground beneath her had shifted. "You let me believe you were a beggar. You let me tell you everything, my family's shame, my mother's illness, things I have told no other living soul, and all the while you were laughing at me, at the foolish plain sister who thought a poor stranger might actually care what she—" "I was never laughing," he said, and the raw urgency in his voice stopped her mid-sentence. "Evelina, I swear to you upon my father's grave, I have never in my life been more sincere with another person than I have been with you these past weeks. I concealed my name because my father, on his deathbed, warned me not to trust the false face that wealth and title summon in others, and he was right to warn me, because I have watched your sister perform grief for an audience of strangers at the village well, and I have watched you give away your own dinner without a second thought, and I did not know how to tell you the truth without losing the only honest conversation I have had in years. You should have told me," she said, and tears she despised herself for were rising hot in her eyes. "You let me hope for something that was never mine to hope for. Your family arranged a match with an Ashworth daughter, and everyone, including you, has understood from the first letter that the daughter in question is Cassandra. I am nothing to you but a diversion you enjoyed on the road to marrying my sister. That is not true. Is it not?" Her voice broke, and she hated that it broke, hated that she could not summon the cold composure the moment demanded. "You are here to court Cassandra, Your Grace. The whole parish knows it. My own mother has spent 4 days arranging ribbons in her hair for your benefit. Whatever this was, between the beggar and the beggar woman at his door, it ends here, because you and I both know it was never going to be permitted to become anything else." She turned and walked away before he could answer, walked the 2 miles home in the gathering dark with her chest aching in a way that had nothing to do with hunger, and if the Duke of Ashcombe called after her, she did not let herself hear it, because hearing it would have meant turning back, and turning back would have meant hoping again, and hope, she reminded herself with every furious step, was an indulgence she could not afford. The formal call, when it came the following afternoon, was everything Evelina's mother had dreamed, and everything Evelina herself dreaded. The Duke of Ashcombe arrived in full and unmistakable splendor this time, bathed and barbered and dressed in the fine dark coat his title demanded, and the transformation was so complete that Evelina, watching from the cottage window as his carriage drew up, felt a fresh wave of that same disorientation, as though the man she had known in the rain had been an entirely different person from the one now stepping down before her family's humble door. Cassandra was, predictably, magnificent. She had chosen a gown of pale blue that set off her golden hair to perfection, and she greeted the Duke with exactly the blend of modesty and warmth she had spent 4 days rehearsing, and Evelina watched her mother's face glow with a hope so naked and so desperate that she could not bring herself to resent her sister for succeeding at the very thing the family needed her to succeed at. The Duke's eyes, however, did not linger on Cassandra's careful performance. They found Evelina instead, standing at the edge of the room in her plain grey dress, and held there with an intensity that made her mother frown in confusion and Cassandra's smile falter, just slightly, at the corners. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and it took Evelina a moment to realize he had addressed her, not her sister, using the family name that belonged equally to both of them, but that convention, and everyone's expectation, had assumed would fall to Cassandra. "I wonder if I might beg a private word." The word beg struck Evelina like a small, deliberate blow, and she saw, in the flicker of his gaze, that he had chosen it on purpose, a quiet echo of the night at the kitchen door, that only the 2 of them would understand. "I do not think that would be proper, Your Grace," Evelina said stiffly, aware of her mother's stricken face and Cassandra's rising color. "Then I shall say what I must say here, before your family, since privacy is apparently a luxury denied to us both." He turned to address the room, though his eyes returned always to Evelina. "I came to this parish a fortnight ago, not as the Duke of Ashcombe, but as a nameless traveller, because my father's dying wish was that I judge my future wife by her true character, unclouded by the performance that title and wealth inevitably summon. I have spent that fortnight observing your family as you truly are, and I will not pretend the observation was without its disappointments." Cassandra's face had gone quite pale. "I watched a young woman weep artfully to strangers, at a village well, about a misfortune she treated as a stage upon which to display her own charms," the Duke continued, and though he did not name Cassandra outright, no one in the room mistook his meaning. "And I watched another young woman walk 2 miles in the rain to beg for bread on her family's behalf, and give away her own portion of it without a second thought, and speak to a ragged stranger with more honesty and more kindness than I have received in a decade of London ballrooms." He paused, and his voice, when it continued, had softened into something private and unguarded, meant, Evelina understood, only for her, though he said it before them all. "I did not fall in love with the Duke's convenient arrangement, Miss Ashworth. I fell in love with a woman who gave away her dinner to a beggar in the rain, and who has looked at me these past weeks with more honesty than anyone else in my acquaintance has managed since my father died." The room had gone utterly silent. Evelina's mother pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Cassandra stood very still, 2 spots of furious color rising in her cheeks. "You cannot mean this," Evelina whispered, torn between the wild hope surging in her chest and the certainty that hope of this size could not possibly be permitted to survive contact with reality. The arrangement was for a larkspur match, a suitable match, and I am not. Your Grace, I am the elder sister. I am considered plain. I bring nothing to such a match, no beauty to speak of, no dowry left to offer, nothing but yourself, he said quietly, closing the distance between them, despite the watching family. Which is, I have come to understand, the only thing I actually wanted. It should have been the ending, and in the story Evelina had permitted herself to imagine, briefly and guiltily, in the days before, it might have been. But the world she lived in was not so simple as a single declaration in a crowded parlor, and the days that followed brought complications neither she nor the Duke had fully anticipated. Cassandra, humiliated before her own family, and stripped in a single afternoon of the future she had spent months constructing, did not accept the reversal with grace. She retreated to their shared bedroom and did not emerge for 2 full days, refusing food, refusing conversation, and when she finally did speak to Evelina again, it was with a coldness that cut deeper than any argument could have. You have taken the only thing that might have saved this family, Cassandra said, her voice flat and brittle. Do you understand what you have done? Mother's health, father's peace, the roof over our heads, all of it depended on a marriage I was raised from the cradle to secure. And you have stolen it from me with nothing but a sad story about giving away your dinner. I did not steal anything, Evelina said, though guilt still gnawed at her, unbidden and unwelcome. I did not seek this, Cassandra. I did not know he was the Duke until the very hour you also learned it. And yet you kept his company for a fortnight, alone, unchaperoned, while I prepared myself for a courtship I believed was mine by right. Did you never think to mention the ragged stranger you had grown so fond of? Or did some part of you already suspect there was more to him than his coat suggested, and you kept him to yourself precisely because of it? The accusation landed with uncomfortable force, because Evelina could not, in perfect honesty, deny that some part of her had sensed Rhys was more than he appeared, even before she had any proof of it, and had said nothing to her sister about their meetings, not entirely out of discretion. She had wanted, she admitted privately to herself in the sleepless hours that followed, to keep something for herself, one small unclaimed happiness in a life spent entirely in service to her family's needs. The admission did not make her a villain, she told herself, but it did not leave her wholly innocent either, and the tangled guilt of it kept her awake long after Cassandra's breathing had evened into sleep beside her. Their mother, for her part, oscillated between disbelief and a kind of stunned, calculating hope, uncertain whether to be furious at the collapse of her carefully laid plans or grateful that a duke's fortune might rescue the family regardless of which daughter secured it. Their father, when informed, said only that he had always found Evelina the more sensible of his 2 daughters, and that sense, in his experience, wore better over the length of a marriage than beauty alone, a remark that earned him a wounded look from Cassandra and a rare, grateful smile from Evelina. The Duke called again 3 days later, and this time Evelina agreed to walk with him in the small garden behind the cottage, chaperoned at a discreet distance by her mother, who had recovered enough of her composure to at least observe the proprieties. Your sister is not wrong to be angry, Rhys said, as they walked between the frost-touched rose bushes. I have upended her expectations without warning, and though I do not regret my choice, I regret the pain it has caused her. I would not have you carry guilt on my account, Evelina, but I understand if some measure of it lingers regardless. It does linger, she admitted. She is my sister. Whatever grew between us, it grew at some cost to her, and I cannot pretend otherwise, simply because the outcome favors me. Then let us find some way to lessen that cost, if we can, he said. I have influence enough to see her well established regardless of this outcome. A proper season in London, introductions to families of good standing who would value her beauty and her wit without the complication of a broken arrangement hanging over her. It will not undo the humiliation of this week, but it need not be the ruin she currently believes it to be. It was, Evelina thought, exactly the kind of gesture she might have expected from the man who had listened so carefully to her confessions in the rain. Generous without being performative, practical without being cold, and she found herself studying his face with something that had moved, quietly, and without her quite noticing the transition, well past mere gratitude. "Why me?" she asked suddenly. "You could have had any woman in the county, Your Grace, once your title was known. Why choose the plain, overlooked sister, when the beautiful one was so readily available and so eager?" He stopped walking and turned to face her fully, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Because eager is not the same as true," he said. "I have spent my whole adult life surrounded by people who wanted something from my title, my fortune, my name, and I had begun to believe that was simply the nature of the world, that no one would ever want merely me. And then I sat on a kitchen step in the rain, in a coat that marked me as worth nothing at all, and a woman gave me half her bread and asked for nothing in return but conversation. Do you understand what that meant to a man who had forgotten such a thing was possible?" "I did not know who you were," she said softly. "I would have given the same to any hungry stranger." "I know," he said, and his voice held something close to wonder. "That is precisely why it meant everything." The engagement, once formally announced, might have proceeded smoothly from that point, had it not been for a complication that arrived from London a fortnight later, in the form of Lady Priscilla Warfield, a cousin of the Duke's on his mother's side, a woman of considerable beauty and considerable ambition who had, it emerged, long harbored expectations of her own regarding the Ashcombe title, and who arrived at Larkspur Hall uninvited and thoroughly unwelcome, determined to see the engagement broken before it could be solemnized. "You cannot be serious, Rhys," Lady Priscilla said, in a private audience she had all but forced upon him, her voice sweetened with false concern. "A country nobody, with no dowry, no connections worth the mention, no beauty to compensate for the deficiencies of her birth. The whole of London will laugh, and the laughter will follow you both for years. Think of the family name. Think of what your father would have wanted." "My father," Rhys said coldly, "specifically warned me against marrying a woman chosen for her family name and her performance of charm, and specifically instructed me to seek out true character instead. If you knew him as well as you claim, cousin, you would know that Evelina Ashworth is precisely the choice he would have approved." But Lady Priscilla was not so easily dismissed, and having failed to move the Duke directly, she turned her efforts toward Evelina instead, calling upon her at the cottage under the guise of friendly welcome and spending the visit delivering a series of carefully aimed cruelties disguised as sisterly advice, remarking upon the shabbiness of the cottage's furnishings, the plainness of Evelina's gowns, the impossibility of a woman raised in such reduced circumstances ever managing a great household with the grace a duchess required. "I do not say this to wound you, my dear," Lady Priscilla said, with a smile that suggested she said it precisely to wound her. "I say it because someone ought to, before you find yourself humiliated before all of London society, unable to name the proper courses at a formal dinner, unable to converse with foreign dignitaries, unable to do anything but blush and stammer, while the ladies of the ton whisper behind their fans about the Duke's charity case. Is that truly the life you wish upon him, upon yourself?" The words found their mark more effectively than Lady Priscilla likely intended, striking as they did against fears Evelina had already been nursing in private, unspoken even to Rhys, about her own suitability for the life he was offering her. She had grown up in reduced circumstances, long enough to feel, in her bones, that she did not belong among dukes and duchesses, that some fundamental deficiency in her upbringing would eventually reveal itself and shame them both. And Lady Priscilla's visit watered that private fear until it grew into something close to conviction. She said nothing of this to Rhys, not wanting to burden him with doubts she was ashamed to hold, and the silence between them, small at first, began to widen into something that troubled him without his fully understanding its cause. "You have grown distant," he said, during a call a few days later, finding her quieter than usual, her answers shorter, her eyes avoiding his in a manner entirely unlike the honest directness he had come to treasure in her. "Have I done something to wound you?" "No," she said, too quickly. "I am only tired, Your Grace. The preparations for the wedding are considerable, and my mother's nerves require constant attending." He did not believe her. She could see it in the slight frown that creased his brow, but he did not press, and the unspoken doubt sat between them like a stone in still water, sending ripples neither of them acknowledged aloud. The rupture, when it came, arrived at a dinner Lady Priscilla had engineered with careful malice, inviting a party of London acquaintances to Larkspur Hall under the pretense of welcoming the future bride, but arranging the conversation throughout the evening to expose every gap in Evelina's unfamiliar education, every unfamiliarity with the customs and references of high society that Evelina's rural upbringing had left her without. She endured question after pointed question with as much composure as she could summon, but composure has limits, and by the time the final course arrived, her hands were trembling beneath the table, and her responses had grown so halting and so miserable that even the less unkind guests began to exchange uncomfortable glances. Rhys, seated at the head of the table, watched this unfold with mounting fury, directed entirely at his cousin, and when he finally intervened, sharply enough to silence the table, the damage to Evelina's composure had already been done. She excused herself before the final course was cleared, retreating to the garden in the cold night air, and it was there that Rhys found her some minutes later. Her eyes bright with tears, she was fighting not to shed. "I cannot do this," she said, before he could speak, the words tumbling out in a rush of humiliation and fear that had been building for weeks. "I cannot be a duchess, Rhys. I do not know the proper forms of address for foreign dignitaries. I have never in my life attended a formal dinner longer than 3 courses. I have spent my adult years mending linens and haggling over flower prices, not studying the conversation of ambassadors. Your cousin is cruel, but she is not entirely wrong. I will humiliate you before all of London, and I cannot bear the thought of it. I cannot bear to become a burden to the very man who once told me, 'Hunger teaches us to notice who else is hungry,' only to discover that I am now the one starving, for a competence I was never taught and cannot summon on command." "Evelina, please," she said, stepping back from him, "let me finish, because if I do not say this now, I fear I never shall. I have spent my whole life being told I bring nothing to a room worth valuing, and I taught myself to believe it did not matter, because I had usefulness instead. I could mend and cook and manage a household on nothing, and that usefulness was enough. But usefulness is not what a duchess requires. A duchess requires polish and grace, and a lifetime of preparation I simply do not possess, and I fear that no amount of love between us, however true, can teach me those things quickly enough to spare you the embarrassment of a wife who does not belong." She turned to leave, and it was the sound of his voice, cracking with an emotion she had never heard from him before, that stopped her. "Do you think," he said, "that I did not feel exactly the same the day my father died, and I inherited a title I had spent my whole life avoiding, and discovered that I did not know the first thing about managing an estate the size of Ashcombe, that I had spent my years as a second son, learning nothing useful because no one expected I would ever need it? I sat in my father's study for 3 days after his funeral, staring at ledgers I could not understand, feeling precisely the fraud you describe feeling now. Do you know what taught me otherwise?" She turned back, uncertain, and found him closer than she expected, his eyes fierce with a sincerity that stopped her breath. "I learned it," he said, "the same way any competent person learns anything unfamiliar, slowly, imperfectly, and with the help of people who cared enough to teach me without judgment. You are not asking to be a duchess tomorrow, fully formed and flawless. You are asking to become one, over years, with a husband beside you who has walked exactly the same unfamiliar road and remembers precisely how frightening it was. My cousin does not want you to fail because she doubts your capability, Evelina. She wants you to fail because your capability, given time, will exceed anything she herself could offer, and she knows it, and it terrifies her. You cannot know that. I know, he said, that a woman who walked 2 miles in the rain to feed her family, who gave away her own dinner to a stranger without a second thought, who has managed a household on nothing and kept her mother's spirits from collapsing entirely under the weight of shame, that woman does not lack capability. She lacks only practice, and practice can be taught. What cannot be taught is the character you already possess in abundance, and that character is the only thing I have ever actually wanted in a wife. The words settled over her, like warmth returning to cold hands, painful at first and then, slowly, healing. She did not answer him immediately, needing a long moment to let the fear recede enough for hope to take its place again. But when she finally spoke, her voice had steadied. "Your cousin will not stop," she said, "not merely with unkind dinners. She wants this marriage broken, and I do not think she will rest until she has achieved it by whatever means available to her. Then we shall face whatever she attempts together," he said, "as we ought to have been doing from the start, instead of allowing her cruelty to fester in silence between us. Promise me, Evelina, that whatever doubt or fear troubles you in the future, you will bring it to me directly, rather than carrying it alone until it grows too large to bear. I cannot fight battles I do not know exist." "I promise," she said, and meant it fully, understanding at last that the distance which had grown between them these past weeks had been born not of any failing in him, but of her own old habit of shouldering every burden silently, a habit that a true partnership would require her to unlearn. Lady Priscilla did not, as it happened, rest quietly after this reconciliation. Her final gambit arrived a week before the wedding, in the form of a rumour deliberately seeded through the London gossip that circulated even in the country parish, a whispered suggestion that Evelina Ashworth had known the Duke's true identity from their very first meeting at the kitchen door, that the entire courtship had been a calculated deception on her part, a scheme to secure a duke through false humility and manufactured kindness. The rumour, malicious and entirely false, threatened to poison the very foundation upon which their bond had been built, since it struck precisely at the honesty Rhys had valued in her above all else. The rumour reached Evelina through her own mother, who repeated it with visible distress, uncertain how to reconcile it with what she believed of her daughter's character. And Evelina understood immediately who must have originated it, and precisely what it was designed to accomplish. She did not wait for Rhys to hear the rumour second-hand, and wonder, even briefly, whether it held any truth. She went to him directly, at Larkspur Hall, and repeated to his face exactly what Lady Priscilla was claiming, watching his expression carefully as she did. "You believe it a possibility," she said, when his face remained troubled longer than she found comfortable, "that I deceived you from the start?" "No," he said, and the immediacy of his answer eased something tight in her chest. "I do not believe it for a moment, Evelina. I have watched you these past months, and I know the shape of your honesty too well to doubt it now, over a rumour engineered by a woman who has proven herself willing to lie for far smaller stakes than this. I was troubled only because I feared the rumour might reach you before I could reassure you of my confidence, and cause you the very pain I see written now across your face." "Then let us end it together," she said, with a resolve that surprised even herself, "before it can grow larger and cause more damage than it already has." Together they confronted Lady Priscilla the following evening, in the presence of witnesses whose testimony could not later be disputed, and Evelina, drawing on a steadiness she had not known she possessed until circumstance demanded it, laid out plainly, and without flinching, the true sequence of events. The accidental meeting at the kitchen door, the fortnight of conversations conducted in genuine ignorance of the Duke's identity, the shock of discovery in the stable yard that Rhys himself could confirm, having witnessed her reaction firsthand. She spoke with a quiet dignity that impressed even the most skeptical of the assembled witnesses, and when Lady Priscilla attempted to press her fabrication further, Rhys himself intervened with a coldness that left no doubt of where his loyalty stood. "You will not speak my future wife's name in falsehood again, cousin," he said, "not in my presence, and not, I think, anywhere else, if you value whatever remains of your own standing in this family. I have watched Evelina Ashworth's character tested more thoroughly in these past weeks than most people's characters are tested in a lifetime, and she has met every test with a grace and honesty that shames the rest of us. I will not have that character slandered by a woman whose own motives have been transparent to everyone but herself since the moment she arrived. Lady Priscilla, faced with the united front of the Duke's certainty and Evelina's calm testimony, retreated from the field with what little grace she could muster, and though she did not remain in the county to witness the wedding, her final defeat marked the last serious obstacle standing between Evelina and the future she had once believed too large to hope for. The wedding itself, when it finally arrived on a bright, cold morning in early spring, was a smaller affair than the grandest London society might have expected of a duke, held in the modest parish church where Evelina had worshipped her whole life rather than some grander cathedral, a choice Rhys had insisted upon precisely because it honored the honesty of where their bond had truly begun. Cassandra, whose fury had softened over the intervening months into something closer to genuine reconciliation, particularly after the promised London season, had indeed secured her the admiring attention of a viscount's second son, who valued her wit as much as her beauty, stood beside her sister as she had once stood beside her in every childhood trial, and wept openly through the ceremony in a manner that struck Evelina as, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely sincere. Their mother, restored to health by the relief of the family's rescued fortunes and by a peace she had not known in years, sat in the front pew with tears streaming freely down her face, and their father, when called upon to give his elder daughter away, whispered to her at the altar's edge words that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. "I always knew," he murmured, "that the daughter who gave without counting the cost would someday receive without measure in return. I am only sorry it took the rest of us so long to see what was in front of us all along." Evelina looked past her father, past the small gathered crowd of neighbours and family, to where Rhys stood waiting at the altar, no longer disguised in a beggar's ragged coat, but dressed now in the fine attire his true rank demanded, and yet she saw in his eyes the very same steadiness she had first noticed on a rain-soaked kitchen step, the same quiet attention that had made her, a stranger to him then, feel seen and valued in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. Whatever finery surrounded him now, whatever title preceded his name, the man who had listened to her confessions in the rain and the Duke who stood waiting to make her his wife were, she understood fully now, one and the same, and had been from the very first moment. "I once told you," he said quietly as she reached him at the altar, too quiet for anyone else to hear, "that there is no shame in hunger. I did not know then how hungry I myself had become, for something as simple and as rare as being truly known by another person. You fed that hunger before you ever knew my name, Evelina, and I have loved you every day since, more fully than I believed myself capable of loving anyone. And I," she whispered back, "once believed that hoping for my own happiness was an indulgence I could not afford. You taught me otherwise, one rain-soaked evening at a time, and I do not intend to forget the lesson for the rest of our lives together." They were married before the small gathered congregation with a joy that needed no grand cathedral to magnify it, and if the story that travelled afterward through the county and eventually through London society itself grew a little more romantic in the retelling with each passing season, the essential truth at its heart remained exactly as it had always been. A woman had once begged at a kitchen door for bread to feed her hungry family, and in doing so had unknowingly fed a hunger far deeper than her own, the quiet, desperate hunger of a man who wanted, more than any title or fortune could provide, simply to be loved for himself alone. And in the giving of one small, unconsidered kindness, she had received, in return, a lifetime of love that no ballroom performance, no calculated charm, no careful pursuit of advantage could ever have secured half so completely. Years later, when their own children asked how their parents had first met, Evelina would tell them the story exactly as it happened, of a rainy night and a stranger on a crate, of bread shared between two hungry souls who did not yet know how much they had in common, and she would always end the telling the same way, with a lesson she hoped they would carry with them long after she herself was gone. Kindness given without expectation of return, she would say, is the rarest treasure a person can offer another, because it cannot be faked, and it cannot be bought, and it reveals more of the giver's true heart than any grand gesture ever could. I did not know, that night at the kitchen door, that I was feeding a duke. I knew only that a stranger was hungry, and that I had bread enough to share. Everything that came after, all the love and the joy and the family we built together, grew from that single small choice to be kind when kindness cost me something, and asked for nothing at all in return. And Rhys, listening from across the room with the same quiet attention he had first turned upon her on a rain-soaked kitchen step so many years before, would smile the private smile of a man who had found, against every expectation his rank and his wounded heart had once permitted him, the one thing he had least expected and most needed, a love that had chosen him, plainly and honestly, before it ever knew his name. There is, in every great house, a small kitchen door that no visitor of consequence is ever meant to notice, a plain and weathered threshold reserved for tradesmen and servants and the occasional wandering beggar the cook takes pity upon in hard weather. At Larkspur Hall, that door was repainted every spring, its hinges oiled, its step swept clean each morning by a girl who had once, long ago, been instructed never to let it stand open too long against the cold. Evelina insisted, in the years that followed her marriage, that the door remain exactly as it had always been, unremarkable and unadorned, though the Duke offered more than once to have it replaced with something finer, something that better suited the grandeur it now indirectly represented. Let it stay plain, she told him each time he raised the matter, for it was plain and unremarkable the night it changed both our lives forever, and I do not believe grandeur improves upon a truth already perfect in its simplicity. She kept a standing instruction with Mrs. Downing, who remained head cook at Larkspur long after the estate passed fully into the Duke's keeping, that no traveller, however ragged, however unpromising in appearance, should ever be turned from that door hungry, and in the years that followed, the parish came to know the kitchen at Larkspur Hall as a place where kindness was given freely and without judgment, a reputation Evelina guarded more fiercely than any title she had gained by marriage. She often walked to that door herself, long after she had any practical need to, simply to sit upon the step in quiet evenings and remember the rain and the crate and the stranger who had asked her nothing more demanding than what troubled her heart, and had listened as though her answer mattered more than anything else in the world. Cassandra, for her part, married her Viscount's son within 2 years, and settled into a marriage that suited her considerably better than the one she had once schemed so hard to secure, for the young man valued her cleverness and her wit, precisely as she was, without requiring the constant performance of grief and charm that had once seemed her only currency. The two sisters, estranged briefly by circumstance and jealousy, grew closer in the years that followed than they had ever been in childhood, bound now, not by rivalry, but by the shared understanding of how narrowly they had each nearly lost what mattered most, and how fortunate they had both, in the end, proven to be. Their mother lived to see grandchildren born at Larkspur Hall, and often told anyone who would listen, with the particular pride of a woman who had once despaired entirely of her family's fortunes, that she had always known her elder daughter possessed a heart too large and too honest for the world to overlook forever, though privately she admitted to Evelina alone that she had, for one shameful season, very nearly overlooked it herself. As for the Duke, he kept, tucked always within his writing desk at Ashcombe, the small cloth in which Mrs. Downing had once wrapped a loaf of bread for a hungry stranger, and the woman who had shared her portion with him, worn soft now with age and handling, a private relic of the night an ordinary kindness had rewritten the whole of his future. He never told anyone but Evelina why he kept it, and she never asked him to explain, because she understood, without needing the words, that some truths were better held quietly between two people who had once been strangers to each other and had become, through nothing grander than shared bread and honest conversation, everything to one another instead. Long afterward, when guests at Larkspur Hall remarked upon the quiet warmth between the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe, a warmth that seemed to deepen rather than fade with the passing years, the older servants would sometimes smile knowingly and say nothing at all, content to let the young couples among the household staff wonder at the mystery of it, and to keep, as their mistress had always kept, the small and sacred truth that the grandest love story the county had ever witnessed had begun not in a ballroom, nor a portrait gallery, nor beneath the chandeliers of a London season, but on a humble step in the rain, where a hungry woman had once knelt to share her bread with a stranger, never once asking what he might give her in return.